Covid19 Country Report. It is an initiative by the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation that they started in March 2020, actually, just after we've known about the virus. And they did it in partnership with GTAC and the National Research Foundation. So just a little bit of background. We've decided, or actually the DPME decided, that it's a very good idea to record the events as they unfold in order to have some kind of storyline about the whole process of the pandemic. So the brief we had when we started the initiative, the research in 2020, was that we need to evaluate the measures and the interventions adopted by government, but also what the other partners did, social partners, the business sector, and other players, and in order to manage the pandemic and to minimize the negative effect of the pandemic on vulnerable groups. So really, the first edition, especially, that was published in last year, it's a 740-page book, a 704-page book, and it literally covers so many thematic areas, from leadership, governance and institutional arrangements, legal and regulatory responses, government's communication strategy and how it unfolded, health, of course, education, tourism, leisure. It looks at the macroeconomic impact, at the impact on vulnerable people. It looks at gender equity, at international cooperation and trade. And the initial edition, the first edition, also looks at how the provinces individually managed the pandemic. So we published that edition, and we're now working on the second edition. The first edition obviously focused on almost on a week-to-week basis. The second edition is less intensive and starts to reflect on what happens and how we are managing the future. So today we have selected two of the chapters that's just finished their work on the second edition, and that is chapter 2. Chapter 1 is the introductory chapter. So chapter 2 is called Leadership, Governance and Institutional Arrangements. And we've been privileged to have Professor Bernd Rosenkranz as the convener of this chapter since the very start, 3 years ago. And so he was convener of the first edition, and he is now of the second edition on this chapter. And Professor Rosenkranz will speak first, and he is a medical doctor, and he's a registered clinical pharmacologist in Germany, where he will speak from. But he's almost time to visit South Africa again. He often visits our country because he's involved in many different ways here. He is president of the Fundisa Medical African Academy of Medicine Development in Cape Town, and he is treasurer of the Manenberg Aftercare Center in Cape Town. And that's just a few of the involvements he's had over the years in South Africa. He will speak with Professor Babette, what am I saying? Babette. He will, Babette Rabie, I'm sorry. I've got the wrong information in front of me. Babette is at Stellenbosch University, and Babette is an associate professor at the School of Public Leadership at Stellenbosch University. And her research focus is actually very much in line with this work we're doing. Babette looks at evidence-based policymaking, because ultimately we would like to get some policies to adjust where and if necessary based on the evidence that we gathered through all these chapters, through all these reports. And of course, very much aligned with the work also of DPME to look at what the role is of monitoring and evaluation in policy making. I'm also going to introduce now Dr Marietjie Botes, who will present Chapter 3. Marietjie is a team member of the Chapter 3 team, and Chapter 3 is all about the legal and regulatory responses. Professor Almine du Plessis is the convener of that chapter, but she cannot join us today. But Marietjie has been a team member for a very long time. And Marietjie is a lawyer, a practicing attorney, or she was a practicing attorney. She worked as an attorney in health law and biotechnology for over 20 years. But these days she is in academia. And she's now at the Center of Medical Ethics and Law, also at the University of Stellenbosch. So with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Professor Rosenkranz. And please let us know if you struggle with projecting the slides. And then, Anita, we said that the speakers will speak one after the other, and after that we will have some time for discussion.
That's correct, Marie.
Okay.
So we can hand over to...
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to, together with Babette Rabie, to present about our work on Chapter 2, Government Leadership, Governance and Institutional Arrangements, and to showcase a bit what we have been doing over the last 3 years. That's a list of the authors who have heavily contributed to this report, including Babette and myself, but also Tian Brink from the Division of Pharmacology in Potchefstroom, Philip Harrison from Wits University, Dewald van Niekerk, who is very much involved in disaster management, writing and editing the law chapter and the law and around all these topics, and Charles Visongi from the Medical Research Council, who is very knowledgeable about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. The objectives of the Chapter 2. Now, the second edition is actually an update of the first edition. As Maria has already indicated, the first edition was for the first year, but now we look at responses from the second year of the pandemic and also consolidate actually recommendations coming from what our observations. So we document learning experiences, successes, challenges, and the lasting effects of the pandemic on economic recovery, livelihoods. We have a special focus on vaccine rollout and vaccine hesitancy, and on components of resilient systems and anticipatory governance, and make recommendations on actually what needs to be done also with respect to future possible disasters. So we take a forward-looking approach and not only document what has been observed, but also reflect on learnings and conclusions from the pandemic for future responses, and prepare recommendations for improved disaster risk management. The research design and methods is qualitative, so we do a document review, look at literature, other documents that are available, perform interviews. I have performed interviews with relevant government stakeholders, but also other people from other areas. And we include then use a variety of interpretive and descriptive techniques. And I would like to take that opportunity also to thank very much all those experts who have contributed to the interviews and have actually agreed to what always have been lively discussions. The content, if you look at an overview of the content, then the sections include good governance and leadership practice for disaster risk management. And then we look at resilience, disaster risk reduction, and the complexities around. Disaster risk reduction with respect to South Africa's governance response, so sector-specific responses, you will see on 1 or 2 examples later, the patterns of the spread, provincial responses. Then we look at draw lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic for disaster risk management. Some of the items and topics that we have been looking at are listed now on the right side. that also includes data management, misinformation, all these sorts of aspects, and goes up to academic research. Based on these lessons learned, we make recommendations for future risks, responses, and prevention in all various different areas. And these recommendations and conclusions, as in the context of requirements for a resilient disaster management response, are then topics that will be addressed also by Babette in her talk a bit later. We prepare a timeline of the pandemic. Actually, that timeline has been moved into chapter 1, which is the introductory chapter. And I'm sure you cannot read all that, but it shows you how we graphically display the timelines, the timeline data. And just to take out and show a few highlights of events from the second year onwards. Early 2021, there was a rollout of the vaccination campaign, as you will all remember. Then from May to July 2021, the third wave of infection took place, the so-called Delta wave, which moved onwards. And in South Africa, largely then there was a shock onset of the fourth wave, which is called the Omicron wave. And then throughout the course of 2022, there was a protracted end to the regulatory development of and initiatives regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. The legal aspects of that will be discussed in a few minutes on the basis of the findings of Chapter 3, which is a legal chapter. And again, have been new outbreaks of the COVID-19 global pandemic from early 2023. And these differences also mean that there had to be a constant change in the nature of the pandemic, which required agility in governance responses. And that's what's also being addressed and looked at. With this, I would like to hand it over to Babette to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Bernd. Thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to present some of our findings. So in jumping straight to the lessons that we've learned, the COVID-19 pandemic definitely increased the appreciation and capacity for disaster risk management planning. But even in the second year, we found that institutionalization and coordinating the response remained problematic. There's pockets of excellence. There are provinces and areas that struggle with capacity, and one sees this in the way that the response is being put forward. The disaster risk management response was definitely fine-tuned, and there has been some improvements in terms of the institutional architecture. I think also in terms of the ability to rapidly respond and put out relevant regulations. But this becomes complicated when there are multiple compounding effects and risks that is simultaneously on the system, as we see in the second year with the civil unrest, as we see with the drought being declared, and other effects that make it difficult to concentrate on one disaster only. Throughout the pandemic, there's been a rapid increase in the adoption of electronic platforms. Databases have become more inclusive, more focused also on capturing the results and the effect on vulnerable groups. But we do see that even with that information being available, there's often a lack of transparency in the reasons for decisions taken. And this was then also further compounded by the misinformation that was in the public domain, and that this was not always countered positively with robust information that provides a basis for the decisions. In the health sector, we see that the response to the pandemic was halted by inefficient information, insufficient infection control and information specialists, so just having dedicated capacity available, and that was not always the case. The PPE disaster with changes of the minister also limiting the response there, and also then the slow start to the vaccination campaign with the initial negotiations on getting access to vaccines, which was problematic. Vaccine hesitancy, and depending on the studies, that reflected on this can be anything between 18% and 51%. And there's also earmarked a slow start to the vaccine and an eventual reduced optimal uptake, which presents particular health benefits. There's different variations between sectors that were hard hit by the lockdown. So some sectors like the tourism sector that was closed for extensive periods of time, there's definitely a longer term repercussion and a slower recovery to the pandemic than the mining sector or the agricultural sector that was not as hard hit or allowed quicker to reuptake the work. And this is also a key lesson to be learned. The effect of these decisions is not just short-term, but definitely have longer-term consequences. In terms of just reflecting on both work within government, but also in the private sector and non-government sectors, increased digitization and flexible work arrangements enabled business continuity. It also enabled the reuptake of service delivery to communities, and that is seeming to be a lasting effect and something that is of benefit if managed well. In the academic research environment, academic studies very quickly adapted to the new area of interest, with a lot of research being adapted also to be done under COVID lockdown circumstances. But challenges in this sector included the emotional state of students, also providing support to students that is not connected to campus, that didn't have access to electronic material, that didn't have access to the study material. And there's definitely a difference between universities that are better resourced and those that are less so. So in terms of some of the emerging successes, things that worked very well, definitely an increase in legal expertise and awareness of the importance of disaster management plans. There's been better coordination between sectors to respond to a national disaster, and also between spheres of government, so national, provincial, local government, and also good partnerships between the public and private sector. Some things that were unprecedented, like enabling access to private sector beds for public sector patients, and there's definitely an opportunity to build on these strengths that were put in place. Also, the development and rollout of IT platforms and databases that really pushed forward quite hard, often also with the help of partners that can lend their capacity because of the shared interest. And that is also something to build on going forward. As said, effective flexible working arrangements that allows virtual and hybrid presentations and environments, leading to a greater efficiency, leading to cost saving in terms of travels. There's a lot of advantages that can be gained here, and those funds can typically then be put back into other service delivery priorities. Good consultation with social partners to get buy-in, good international relations that was strengthened due to this common pandemic, this common enemy, and also some sound foundations to work on going forward. South Africa proved itself to have excellent biomedical research capacity. In some cases, we wish we could not identify Omicron as quickly as we did, but these kind of things prove where we are and the capacity that is available and that we can build on and really strengthen also as a country. The mass vaccination campaign was also a first of its kind, also well thought through, starting with the high target groups or the high risk groups, the digital vaccination certificates, which was on par with what we find also internationally, and then also to have the established protocols relevant for similar respiratory pandemics. So across all our research, a lot of respondents said that if we were to face a similar pandemic, we now know how to respond to that. Of course, the next disaster may look different, and that was also the feeling by many respondents, that if it is different, we may not be as well prepared. And that leads us to specific challenges as well. So, sorry, I went too far. Just go back. So in terms of some of the limitations, just in terms of governance, I think we found that the disaster risk management sector focal points and structures are insufficient to coordinate not just one disaster, but multiple disasters, especially when the extent of this affects the whole of society. The involvement of the security cluster as the lead to drive what is in many cases a non-security disaster was not always sufficient or appropriate. The tools and the modus operandi is not necessarily the kind of response that you want to get social or humanitarian response or to get a social adaptation. And this is something to consider, that different disasters would require a different way of organizing, and that these things need to be put in place, not when we have a disaster, but rather beforehand, to allow us to test and perfect these. There was insufficient coordination between the sectors and spheres of government. There was definitely cases where health, for example, would say we stand in isolation. This is now our problem, but yet there are many others that need to work with this. Disaster management centers that the staff just simply burned out because they were at the forefront, constantly dealing with a pandemic that was not ending. And this is also something that we need to think about. And then the effectiveness between provinces were different. The way that they managed their resources, where they located the disaster risk coordination was different. And I think, again, there's a need for a unified national resilience framework to govern this and provide sound foundation and guidelines for how to respond to different types of pandemics. The District and Metropolitan Joint Operations Centers had a well-coordinated response, but we know that these were not implemented in all of the provinces. In the initial phases of the pandemic, there was a lot of services that could not be delivered that due to lockdown, and these had definite negative consequences on our communities and specifically on vulnerable groups. And then later, as these opened up, there was a backlog in services, and that also then extended. So the shift to online service delivery, to business continuity, to ensure that services can still be delivered in the face of a pandemic and in the face of a crisis, is also something that we need to strengthen and work on. Government procurement processes was also delayed. Even with emergency procurement, there are some challenges. We need to strengthen these as well. Just in terms of the humanitarian response, we find that in the second and third wave, as the initial response to the pandemic started to become more routinized, there was a greater focus on humanitarian action. I think the capacity was just more so there to really strengthen social behavior adaptation and to start focusing on economic recovery from the pandemic. And I think these are positive signs of emerging and coming out from the pandemic. In many of the interviews that we had, unfortunately, in this phase, although government wanted to provide support, especially for those hard-hit sectors, for example, performing arts, the financial support is simply not sufficient. If you take a person's way to earn a living away for a year and you give them a month's salary, it simply fails to compensate for that. And so in certain economic sectors, tourism, small businesses, we definitely see a longer term result of this lockdown specifically, and the recovery process is proving to be slower. There's improved information management on the pandemic data, but it's still not sufficient to track the effects of lockdown on vulnerable groups. So again, there's pockets where some departments have managed to put this in place and you can start to see the effect. But in many cases, if a person is not well connected, if a person doesn't have access to electronic services, the ability to collect the data is less. And then also government's ability to respond appropriately and timeously to these vulnerable groups become restrained. And then there was no plan for the management of widespread misinformation on social media and other platforms. And that had different effects on specifically vaccination uptake, but also other government responses in terms of the pandemic. I'm going to hand back to Professor Rosenkranz, who can reflect on the health consequences and the lessons learned there.
Yeah, thank you very much. On the healthcare system, we heard already the successes in the area of the healthcare system, which included also the strong biomedical research capacity and other issues. I would like also to mention the regulators' expertise. SAPRA has an excellent reputation. Has very well managed the implementation of the vaccine from the regulatory side. Limitations are listed here. Some of them have been mentioned already. Changes in the Minister of Health with the communication issues around this. The PPE disaster was another example that caused concern also amongst the public. There have been insufficient government leadership decisions on the vaccine procurement and on the policies. Regarding vaccines, provision of vaccines, that worked very well, and there were funds available, but then there was lack of funds for the transport of vaccines, and there was insufficient personnel for implementation of the IT system. And also there was a lack of other experts in other areas, information management, and permanent staff members to deal with infection control. These were all areas where there were deficiencies. In KZN, we all know that following the July 2021 riots, there was also a loss in the vaccine momentum. There is an insufficient number of permanently employed technical specialists within the National Department of Health. And altogether, there has been an undermining of the public trust by a lack of transparency, as discussed very much in detail then in the report. And someone needs to help me with moving the slides forward.
I will do so. I think maybe.
There it is.
Are you good? Okay.
There we are. Altogether, there had been a rumor or some indication that South Africans fared very well with respect to mortality, as the disease was not so severe, but that is not substantiated by the numbers. So the excess death rates are listed here as documented by the Medical Research Council, and the number of excess deaths from May 2020 until beginning of January of this year is more than 300,000, 341,000 as indicated on the upper left side of the slide here. So that's quite a considerable number. And if you look at excess deaths per 100,000 population, which gives you then sort of a benchmark, that number of 573 is also, internationally speaking, quite a high number. What you also see if you look down in the second number column here, excess deaths per 100,000 population per individual province, that you see that there's quite a difference between the different provinces. Eastern Cape quite high, Western Cape less than half of this, and that needs more exploration why that is actually the case. Another issue regarding the variation in vaccination levels is shown here. So there is quite some difference between the different provinces in the vaccination rate. Top left, the Free State with about 60% of the population being vaccinated, and KZN, I mentioned that earlier, on the lower right side with 45%. So again, these are issues to look into where that actually comes from. And with this, I would like to give it back again to Babette.
Thank you, Bernd. So I think just reflecting on some of the recommendations that we see from the COVID pandemic and the way government responded to that, these kind of risks and emergencies don't just manifest overnight, and the compounding effect of many underlying stresses definitely hinders our ability to effectively respond to a risk once it is there. So we can see that the struggling economy, poverty, corruption in South Africa definitely worsened our COVID-19 effect. And if one can focus on addressing the underlying risks, the problems that is in society now, it can definitely lessen your ability to face a risk in the future, but also strengthen government's ability to respond appropriately when these risks occur. To do this, it's important to build and institutionalize a resilient and connected disaster risk management system that can respond and recover to different risks and crises. So traditionally, our system has been very well focused on what happens in terms of a drought, but the kind of risks that we are going to face is different. And we need to also bring in agility and resilience in our system and the ability to be adaptable to different types of risks. This requires legal and financial resilience. For financial resilience, fiscal consolidation, economic growth, stability, support for vulnerable groups is going to be critical. And Chapter 3 would focus more on the legal resilience criteria that is necessary. It's important to continuously strengthen our data systems. This requires investments. It requires partners and knowledge and know-how, if not available in the public sector, in the private sector, or elsewhere, in order to ensure that you have accurate information that's real-time, that shows you not where the problem is now, but rather where the problem is going to move to next, so that you can preemptively start your response even before the disaster hits there. There were pockets where this was actually able to happen in COVID, and that was very useful. We need to strengthen trust and communication between government departments, between government spheres, with civil society, with vulnerable groups. It's really about the implementation of a networked governance approach where government is but one partner in a development approach, and that it works with other partners to move things forward, leading but not necessarily the sole controller and implementer of all actions. There needs to be greater agility, innovation, and strengthened capacity for a successful governance approach for ongoing delivery, even in the face of a crisis. And we need to build on the stronger international partners and relationships that we have managed to instill with this response. So the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic can enable us to develop a more robust, resilient, and sustainable disaster risk management system. There are some key components to such a system, and this comes from my very learned friends and partners and co-authors that can be put in place to move forward. When faced with a disaster, it's important that all government leaders adopt a holistic response to that. There needs to be a shared vision. And in many aspects, the NCCC managed to put that shared vision in place. It is also important to understand that government departments still maintain a particular mandate. And it's therefore this balance between working towards a coherent whole within the mandate that's assigned to every department. Your legislative response need to also always try to maximize individual autonomy, to not take away freedom of choice, because the moment that you take away the freedom of choice, the effect seems to be more and the ability to recover is delayed. So it's always a balancing act between how much can you restrict it and where does it actually promote the common good, and at one point does it no longer promote the common good. And again, Chapter 3 can also reflect on it. There needs to be the adoption of disaster risk management plans by all organs of the state. But I think here it's also about strengthening the quality of what goes into disaster risk management planning, that it's not just a compliance exercise where certain things are regurgitated from year to year, from plan to plan, but really responding to what are the risks in that particular sector, the chances of them happening, and what needs to be put in place. And all together governed then by a oversight and accountability regime. It's important that these risks is acknowledged as shared societal risks, and therefore it involves all stakeholders and the interconnectedness between government spheres and non-government actors to respond appropriately to complex disasters. I think we're well placed to respond to this type of disaster, but are we also well placed to respond to different types of disasters, and what do we need to strengthen and put in place in order to move this forward? The disaster risk management strategy of a particular government sphere or a department or agency needs to also provide for business continuity, for fairness in all groups, to ensure and promote equity and support to those that are vulnerable, and to focus on good governance arrangements, even in the context of a crisis. Nationally, this is coordinated appropriately by an adequately equipped disaster management centre, and that these centres are also replicated at all spheres of government. There's a need to think about where we place the disaster management centre, if it is ideally placed where it is at the moment, or whether it should be more centrally located. In different provinces, we saw differences in where these centres are placed, and that is also an area of further investigation. And then thinking about the authority assigned to these centres in the context of a disaster, how many staff and how competent and skill sets should these staff have? What are the resources assigned to them, especially then also access to information and reporting and communication between them and other partners that respond to a disaster. It's definitely important to focus on economic resilience. The ability to mitigate and respond to a disaster is strongly influenced by your financial means to do so. So in this, it's about bringing in economic resilience, but it's also bringing in a more getting in front of the curve mindset, a proactive response to disaster mitigation rather than a retrospective disaster management response. It's important that your data in information systems are responsive and up to date and provide your decision makers with the information that they need at a particular point in order to make the right decisions. And if that information is not available or information comes only later, then your decision makers are flying blind. And therefore, this kind of strengthening is important. Communication is critical. You need to have clear communication with all partners so that they understand where we're going, what decisions are being made, but also why these are being taken, and also to have a specific strategy to counter misinformation. And it's increasingly becoming important in the society that we live in. And then specific attention to vulnerable groups, those that are less resilient, those that are less resourced, that are less connected, require a specific component in a disaster risk management strategy and response in order to support them appropriately. And then in the final slide, predetermined responses, including public procurement, can limit the opportunity to exploit the disaster or to advance specific agendas. Once you make these processes and decisions within the context of the disaster, you are already in crisis mode, and it opens up an opportunity for exploitation. These systems need to be strengthened outside of the concept of a disaster and tested and appropriately negotiated so that when the disaster is there, they can simply be implemented. Strengthening the trust relationship between the public and the state could enable the state to have more clout and more opportunity to direct a response. If that trust is not there, it has a negative effect throughout. And then lastly, to think about how this disaster also provides an opportunity to transform and encourage change. Not all disasters are bad. Disasters are sometimes a good point to start thinking about what is wrong in society and how do we need to rebuild it to make it better. So thinking about alternative delivery mechanisms, flexible arrangements, data systems, there's also a lot of positive things that can come from it. It's only about how you respond to it and making sure that we see this as an opportunity to build forward better. So let me pause there and then hand back to the convener. Thank you, Bernd.
Thank you. Thank you, Babette. Thank you, Bernd. Let's go straight into chapter 3. And there's a logical flow to chapter 3. Babette ended by saying a lot about the resilience of the system. And we will now look at how resilient our legal framework, our law was in managing the disaster to date. Thanks, Marietjie.
Hey everyone. I'm just waiting for technology to help me out here.
Sure.
There we go.
Thank you.
Right. So thank you very much. I'll be presenting on behalf of a group of legal eagles convened by Professor Elmien du Plessis. Some of my co-authors include Professor Danrich Thaldar, Professor Henny Strydom, Professor Marius Pieterse, Ms. Tamanda Kamwendu, myself, as well as Professor Narnia Boller-Muller. So in this chapter, we will specifically deal with how to move from the current emergency responses to a sustainable long-term approach to the pandemic control. So this will specifically focus on the second half of the pandemic. So in this chapter, we look at the resilience that the law showed or not, and where it could be strengthened. And in this context, by resilience, we mean the capacity of a system to withstand or adapt to disturbance while maintaining the same basic structures and functions. So the main question we've asked is, do governance, legal processes, and systems have enough flexibility, redundancy, and learning capacity to adapt to disturbances such as COVID and the surprises that comes with it, without collapsing or flipping into fundamentally different systems? So I think it's ad idem that COVID-19 has been a breaching incident that generated tremendous change globally. And sometimes it also resulted in major shifts in human rights practices because of major shocks to the system. But this also allowed us a very small window of opportunity to effect very large changes to existing systems. So we must see this also as an opportunity. So the first, I will just talk about certain of the main issues we dealt with in the chapter. In the interest of time, I cannot relate everything we discussed in the chapter, but let's start off with the rule of law and decision-making issues, and specifically in the Disaster Management Act context. So the state of disaster started or was officially declared on the 27th of March 2020. And the state of disaster was officially ended by the 5th of April 2022. In South Africa, our response to COVID-19 has almost entirely been based or governed by the Disaster Management Act. Now, despite extensive litigation whether the Disaster Management Act was the correct tool to do so or not, the Supreme Court of Appeal did confirm in the matter of ESO versus Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs that the executive power was validly exercised and that there was enough accountability mechanisms in the Constitution to oversee this power. However, concerns still remain about the absence of proper checks on the minister's power to extend the state of disaster. The reason for this is because the Disaster Management Act is completely silent on what the minister must consider when extending a state of disaster. And in the context of the Disaster Management Act, it's important to note that a disaster is defined as a progressive or sudden, widespread or localized natural human cause occurrence, which causes or threatens death, injury, or disease, as COVID did, disruption of the life of a community, as it did globally, and this is of importance, and is of a magnitude that exceeds the ability of those affected by the disaster to cope with its effects using only their own resources. So with every extension of the state of disaster, it is assumed that the magnitude of the events exceeded the state's ability to manage this pandemic within its available resources. Now, bearing that in mind, one needs to consider during the fourth pandemic wave, the Omicron wave, this wave did not constrain government resources, nor did it pose the same risk as the previous wave. So it's questionable, and it could be debatable whether a state of disaster had to be extended under those circumstances. So in view hereof, our recommendations are that Parliament should include requirements either in the National Disaster Management Framework or by amendments to the Disaster Management Act to mitigate the risk that a state of disaster is extended beyond the duration of the actual disaster. And I think most importantly, is to ensure that so-called non-disaster public health laws and regulations are indeed capable of responding appropriately to health and social threats of pandemics without necessarily resorting to legislative state of exceptions. So another piece of legislation that came under close scrutiny as part of the rule of law and decision-making issues is the National Health Act. Now, on 15 March 2022, the Minister of Health published draft regulations for public comment to amend the regulations relating to the surveillance and the control of notifiable medical conditions as issued in terms of the National Health Act. So this amendment dealt with a wide array of notifiable medical conditions. There's an entire list listed in Annex A with tables, etc., that list these notifiable medical conditions and regulations applicable to them. But the draft regulations or the amendments sought to these regulations may have the minister declare by notice in the Government Gazette a medical condition which is not listed in the annexure as a notifiable condition in certain circumstances. However, there is no duty on the minister to consult anyone before publishing such a notice. And there's nothing in the regulations set out or that set out parameters for the minister before imposing restrictions on fundamental rights in combating such a notifiable disease. And in addition, it appears that the full content of the COVID-19 disaster regulations have simply been copied and pasted or incorporated into this amendment in respect of notifiable conditions. So it seemingly is possible to have these notifiable conditions regulations triggered not only in the event of a flare-up of COVID-19, but also in the case of other notifiable medical conditions, which may have completely different characteristics, infectious consequences, and impacts on society as COVID-19. So our recommendations against this backdrop is that to provide requirements that the minister must have or give reasons for listing a condition as a notifiable medical condition, and building from our experience with the Omicron variant, to consider the transmissibility of a disease, its severity, and its impact on the health system. Take that into account before going over to limit certain constitutional rights and fundamental rights. So, in addition, in line with international guidelines and the limitation clause of the Constitution, we must provide criteria and processes for declaring a pandemic an endemic. Regulations should also explicitly only provide for such restrictions on fundamental rights that are proportionate to and justified by the threat posed by that particular notifiable medical condition, which we will need to determine on a case-to-case basis. And then lastly, the criminalization of non-compliance with these regulations should be reconsidered. I will say a little more about the criminalization, specifically in the context of misinformation in just a moment. Another issue that came to the fore during the second half of the pandemic was the vaccine and the vaccine injury fund. Vaccines and access to vaccinations were dealt with specifically in the first edition, so I'm not going to reiterate that issue here, but you can read all about it in the first edition. But during the second part of the pandemic, the vaccine injury fund was created. As a result of the bilateral agreements the SA government entered into with various vaccine manufacturers, these vaccine manufacturers required that they were given immunity against any civil litigation or liability arising from vaccine-related harms, and that the South African government should rather bear any liability coming as a result of that. So in response to this, the SA government introduced the COVID-19 vaccine injury no-fault compensation scheme in April 2021. So in April 2022, the Minister of Health published directions for the administration of the scheme, the reporting of injuries, the claim system, the eligibility requirements, and all matters surrounding the adjudicational panel and much more. Concerns about the government's ability to actually successfully manage this fund were raised. were raised specifically with reference to the failure of the government to manage similar schemes and with more reference to this road accident fund. So injuries that qualified for compensation in terms of this funding scheme were all injuries resulting in permanent, temporary, mental impairment or death, and only resulting from vaccines administered after the 17th of May 2021 and vaccines procured before the 5th of April 2022. Claims must be reported within 30 days after the onset of any symptoms received from vaccines, and amounts in respect of compensation were capped to 150,000 Rand in the event of death, and up to a maximum amount of 150,000 Rand in event of permanent disability, and then 5,000 Rand per month for a maximum period of 6 months in case of temporary disability. It's also important to note, if you want to institute a claim against this fund, it's not necessary to establish fault. This is in line with also the no-fault liability regime instituted or introduced by the Consumer Protection Act or legislation in South Africa. But a link must be caused between the vaccine and the injury resulting from that vaccine. So in this context, our recommendations included that, or said that the effectiveness of the vaccine injury fund can only be assessed once it has become operational. And that route still remains to be seen, as it is still early days and no big cases has yet resulted from vaccine injuries and this fund. However, the existence of this fund does not quite fit well within the Disaster Management Act framework. Disaster management legislation is not meant to continue beyond the actual existence of the disaster. So it is suggested that any regulations relating to an injury fund or a vaccine injury fund is rather move under the regulatory framework of the National Health Act, so that could stay in a regulation even outside a disaster management framework. So the next issue I want to talk about is mandating or obligatory vaccines. Now, vaccine mandates all over the world remains a very controversial issue, not only in South Africa. It involves various rights that needs to be balanced and are contained in the Constitution, such as the right to health, life, freedom of religion, a healthy environment, freedom and security of person, the right of control over one's own body, the right not to be subjected to medical and scientific experiments. And all of these rights are also subject to the limitation clause and needs to be balanced against the right to public interest. So the Human Sciences Research Council did very interesting research in this regard, and they found that 8,000 people, out of 8,000 people, approximately 28% of those that were surveyed in June, July 2021 were very reluctant to take the COVID-19 vaccine. So from a mandatory vaccination point of view, there's arguments against it and there's arguments for it. Some of the arguments against it constitutes that the constitutional or the Constitution holds the moral vision that people are autonomous agents and that they are fully capable of making rational decisions and forming their own opinions. Before mandates in respect of vaccinations is warranted, a less restrictive policy should rather be followed. Another argument against is that the lack of public trust in governments and governments' failures in respect of vaccine rollouts might have a counterproductive role in people's opinions regarding vaccinations. And sometimes vaccine hesitancy is driven by conspiracy theories. And I will say a word or two regarding misinformation in this context later on. But against this backdrop, there may be greater pushback against vaccines if it is mandated or made obligatory. So arguments for vaccine mandates includes the restriction on individual rights through mandatory vaccinations are not arbitrary, but based on a legitimate objective and must be strictly necessary for the achievement of policy objectives such as the prevention of the transmission of infectious disease based on sound scientific evidence. Just want to move my slides forward. So our recommendations in this context is that mandates should only be the very last resort. We recommend that mandates cannot be used as policy alternatives to good governance principles or democratic principles such as public participation, open debate, and the inclusion of a diversity of voices in decision-making. If decisions to impose vaccine mandates flow from either of the two reasons above not being adhered to, that will not pass constitutional muster. It can only be or pass constitutional muster if it's used as a supplement for government's failure in either good governance or the exercise of democratic principles. So in the interest of time, I will briefly refer to certain sectorial decisions, which we also discussed in our chapter. I can just put in the following caveat to say that many, if not all of these sectorial decisions is being dealt with extensively in follow-up chapters that deals exclusively with some of these sectors in the COVID country report. So one of the issues was the whole issue regarding children and getting vaccines or children being vaccinated between the ages of 12 to 17. So concerns were raised about getting vaccinated with or without parental consent. Now, the National Health Act provides for informed consent when you obtain medical treatment or undergoing medical interventions. The Children Act specifically deals with consent to medical treatment and surgical operations by children. And it specifically states that children which are of sufficient maturity over the age of 12 may consent to their own medical treatment if they have sufficient mental capacity to understand the benefits and the risk of this treatment. And for invasive interventions, they further require the assistance of parents or guardians. Now, the argument could be made that getting vaccinated by a vaccine of which the long-term effects are unclear or uncertain poses additional risks, which children, even if they are of sufficient age and mental capacity or maturity, may not grasp and therefore may require the assistance of parents or guardians. So that's still open for debate, and that was a point of heated discussion during the rollout of the vaccines specifically for children. In addition, during the pandemic, South Africa underwent or were scheduled to underwent a municipal election. And the decision had to be made on a governmental level whether to postpone its municipal elections that were scheduled for the 27th of October 2021. The Constitution in this regard requires that elections be held within 90 days of the end of the term of office for local government. Now, the last local government elections were held on the 3rd of August 2016, and the next election had to be held no later by the 1st of November 2021. Unfortunately, no provisions is made for a discretion to postpone the elections either in the Constitution or in any other legislation. So the Electoral Committee instituted a formal inquiry to ascertain whether there will be any negative effects with regards to free and fair elections if they continue to hold the elections, the municipal elections, in October 2021. And the committee held, or it was found that there may be a risk of unfair and free or not free elections. And they suggested a postponement of these elections until February 2022. However, it resulted in litigation, and the Constitutional Court disagreed. So a recommendation is that the government must ensure that it has contingency plans and is flexible with regards to possible future disaster situations when it comes to specifically municipal elections and possibly other elections as well. Another huge issue that came to the fore during the pandemic was housing. It became so clear that informal settlements and impoverished areas proved far less resilient against health and economic impacts of COVID than more upmarket suburban areas. It was clear that suboptimal living conditions in informal settlement, overcrowded inner city buildings and backyards aggravated the vulnerability of these people to infections and serious illnesses. Their adherence to stay-at-home or lockdown measures, as well as their efficacy and social impact, was contingent to the nature of their home environments. Some of them simply could not lock down in the crowded environments they daily lived in. As well, the economic consequences of lockdown threatened the security of housing arrangements and even rendered many vulnerable people and populations to evictions. However, under alert levels 1, 2, and 3, eviction orders could be granted, but they could not be executed, in other words, enforced, until the end of the state of the national disaster. The government tried to solve the overcrowding problems by emergency relocations, executed in terms of partnership framework agreements. And they envisaged conditions in informal settlements that would be tackled through upscaled implementation of the upgrading of informal settlement programs. Similarly, the Disaster Management Act also envisages the creation of an inherently temporary regulatory framework designed to last only for the duration of the state of the disaster. The Constitutional Court support this previous held opinion that relocations in terms of the Disaster Management Act could only be temporarily unless they also complied with the PI Act. So in this context, the Disaster Management Act is an inappropriate legal vehicle for sustainably addressing overcrowding in informal settlements. So as much as it helped during the pandemic only highlighted systemic weaknesses in the legal and institutional architecture of human settlement governance. And it underlined how housing problems are systemic in nature and are not easily or consistently solved through short-term emergency measures. And that needs to receive attention going forward before the next pandemic strike. Another issue was social grants. As we've seen, a lot of people living in poor conditions. Stats SA confirmed that the poorest 60% of South African household relies on social grants to attain their overall household income. This impacted greatly on pandemic measures taken on the labor market and its impact it had on the disproportionate impact it had on individuals in lower income households. In the absence of exceptional support programs for businesses and households alike to mitigate these effects of lockdown, as much as 2 to 3 million people lost their jobs in a mere 3-month period between February and April 2020. In addition, approximately 18% of South African citizens, that equates to about 3 million people, work in the informal sector. So they do not qualify for social assistance unless they qualify for old age, child support, or disability grants. In this regard, the Budget Justice Coalition emphasized the below inflation increases for crucial social grants such as child support. Regardless of the fact that social relief of distress grants, which amounted to 350 Rand per month, has been extended for a year, their failure to commit to further extensions up for the years 2023, 2024, and 2025 meant that basic income of most vulnerable people became very uncertain. And that was aggravated by the overall reduction of social protection spending, averaging 3% a year over the medium-term expenditure framework. So the Budget Justice Coalition called for a human rights impact assessment to be conducted for this and other individual budget decisions where human rights are impacted. So this brings us also to people with disabilities that relies on social grants, but also to investigate their living conditions. Between 12 to 20% of citizens live with a spectrum of disabilities, from immobility to partial immobility to restricted communication, sensory deprivation, psychosocial and neurological complications. Disabled people were at a higher risk for food insecurity. Mask wearing was severely challenging for people living with arthritis, Parkinson's disease, dementia or Alzheimer's, people living on the autism spectrum, people living with speech issues, and even hearing impaired people who could not lip read other people. Disabled children could not access special facilities and their schooling regressed. Disabled people with weakened immune systems did not have priority access to vaccinations, nor did their caregivers, and people were also cut off from physiotherapy, rehabilitation services. They were isolated from friends and possibly caregivers due to a fear of the risk of contracting the virus. So the Disaster Management Act makes no mention of persons with disabilities or contain any disability inclusive approaches to manage the disasters. So there is a white paper on the implementation matrix 2015 to 2030 of the white paper of the rights of persons with disabilities that include persons with disabilities as a specific vulnerability group. But the requirements and the conditions contained therein has not yet occurred. So attention must be given in respect to those. So lastly, I just want to say something about surveillance privacy and misinformation, which was a big problem during the pandemic. With regards to surveillance of the disease and privacy, the South African government introduced the COVID Alert SA app, which is an exposure notification system whose function relies on proximity awareness as opposed to the collection and storage and use of personal location data. This technology was used globally in many areas and supported by privacy law scholars around the world. But many people, often entire poor populations, only possess very old phones and could not access and use these technologies. So they weren't surveyed with regards to contact tracing apps at all. Interesting enough as well, the public also expressed their concerns about the fact that this app was officially owned and managed by the South African government. But this was not just a South African problem. In the United Kingdom, people had the same concerns. They were concerned about who was in charge of the tracing activities and oversaw their data. And the majority of these people indicated that they much rather prefer health organizations, independent health organizations, as opposed to governments to manage their infection surveillance. Another interesting fact is that at the height of our pandemic and the rolling out of the COVID Alert SA app and the collection of data, whatever, our Protection of Personal Information Act has not yet been enacted. So that made the regulation and the enforcement of data privacy laws a bit trickier, regardless of the fact that the information regulator did issue some guidelines in this respect. So the takeaway here is to successfully implement privacy-respecting surveillance technologies, it is of critical importance that we understand social privacy preferences and contextual differences. So the last word on misinformation is that an infodemic also occurred in parallel to the pandemic. Now, an infodemic is an overabundance of information, some accurate, some not, that spreads alongside a disease outbreak. At times of great uncertainty and specifically situated within our digital age, this allows for infodemics to spread on an unprecedented speed and scale. This turns uncertainties into fear-mongering, skepticism, distrust, and ultimately fear, anxiety, finger-pointing, stigma, violent aggression, and most importantly, the dismissal of proven public health measures, which risks the lives and livelihoods of everybody involved in the pandemic. South Africa took the step of criminalizing the spread of so-called fake news in a regulation issued in terms of the Disaster Management Act. And it specifically stated that any person who publishes any statement through any medium, including social media, with the intention to deceive any other person about COVID-19, commits an offense and is liable on conviction to a fine or imprisonment. Our concern or criticism is with the difficulty of distinguishing between what is a truth, a half-truth, speculation, possibilities, or downright fake news. So it seems harsh and arbitrary punishment without extraordinarily little guidance as to the evaluation of what truth seems to be under these circumstances. It is very difficult to determine whether someone must be punished for knowingly spreading false information whilst that person cannot even evaluate the truth of the statements he or she is spreading. Further considering that a disease was completely novel, including the vaccines that was developed was completely novel, there was no long-term information about the long-term effects of the vaccines because they were developed literally at warp speed. So considering that the criminalization lies in the intentionality to deceive another person, it is very hard under these circumstances to prove or ascertain that, let alone to criminalize that. So these are just some of the highlights we discuss in chapter 3. Further information will be available in the chapter, but I thank you for listening to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marietjie. It's so interesting, especially in the first edition, we had all the legal cases that were taken to court. I found them so interesting. We have a few minutes left for discussion. Can I see any hands? I don't see anything in the chat box, so any hands to either chapter 2, to Bernd or Babette, or to Marietjie? Saw a hand and then it left again.
Anita raised the hand.
Sorry, it was just by mistake. I don't see any hands, Marie.
Yeah, let's give it for a minute or two. Any comments? We'll, while people are thinking, we will have another of these webinars featuring 2 more chapters late in April. I must still confirm, but I do think it will be also a very interesting chapter on international relations, where there's a lot of discussion on the vaccine debacle. So that should be very interesting, but I must still see which other chapter we will be able to feature with that. And we'll send the invitation to, with the normal channels. So building up towards the process of launching and publishing the 2nd edition report, we will share it with the wider public. Okay, if there's no questions or discussion, we did schedule from 2 to 3:30. So I once again want to really thank the teams that I've been working now for almost 3 years, and specifically in this
Sorry,
case.
Marie, I see a question in the chat from Fundisa. Maybe I can just read it. It says, what is your take on the decision of government to take the responsibility of the effects of the vaccine?
That's an interesting question, Marietjie.
I would have loved to be a fly in the wall during those negotiations. I can only speculate about what happened. Rather get the vaccines and accept the liability, but deflect the liability to an injury fund like I did. So I wasn't part of that negotiations, but it's a risk to the government, and it's usually the pharmaceutical company that's supposed to take that risk, legally speaking. But as I say, I wasn't part of the negotiations, and I think I would assume that to get the vaccines as opposed to not to get the vaccines, they could have made that decision. I don't know.
I can maybe add that from the European side that there were similar discussions, or are now similar discussions with different regulatory agencies and also with governments. And in Germany, for example, there is also, the government has taken over, and Europe taking over the responsibility for a while, and that causes now a lot of discussion, because now some side effects are emerging, and actually there are now law cases that take place. It's interesting to hear that that is not yet an issue in South Africa, but I would expect that will come.
Also looking out for those cases. They will inevitably be on their way, I assume.
Anyone else? Okay, then I can just thank again Bernd and Babette for your presentations of Chapter 2 and Marietjie for Chapter 3. We appreciate all the hard work. Anita has put the link there, but she's earlier also put the link for the first edition report. Thank you for that. Okay, so with that, if you have time, you can rate your experience, and we'll see you in a few weeks for another session of the COVID report.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, thank you.